We have the challenge before us. Let's break through that isolation that in some situations was imposed by government. In some situations, it was imposed by other tyrants. And in some situations, it was imposed by either ourselves or the people who love us most. It's a new day. I hope you accept the challenge. The shackles of isolation no longer hold us. Hi, welcome back to the Dr. Scott Jensen podcast. I'm Dr. Scott Jensen, and I have shared with you previously that this podcast is not going to focus on politics. This podcast is going to focus on you, your philosophy of living, what goes on in shaping our lives, and specifically, we're going to talk about safety and what does accountable government look like and what does freedom look like for parents and in the arena of health and in so many other aspects of our lives. And what's happening with education in our grade schools, our middle schools, our high schools, but also post-high school. How are we educating? How are we helping people get expertise? How are we helping people get expertise in the trades, in the areas where the economy is desperately short of talented people? How do we educate in our colleges and universities? And we're always going to have a mind's eye towards where is tyranny. So having said all that, today I want to talk about one word. I wish this one word weren't so important, but it is. Because this one word is the root cause of breaking up our cities, increasing crime, fracturing families, kicking the Constitution aside, allowing tyranny to proliferate. This one word is isolate. We've got to talk about what's happening in our world today based on isolation. I generally like to start my podcast with at least repeating this one sentence from George Orwell. In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act. So we're going to talk about isolation. Whenever we talk about something, I think it's always easier if we can have some place to land on this issue. So what do I mean by isolation? Well, maybe not, you've seen Hunger Games. But Hunger Games was a series of movies. Initially, it was a series of books. But in it, the earth went into an extended lockdown. Families were isolated from other families. Even family members were isolated from family members. When people saw the Hunger Game, they cringed. They couldn't imagine that kind of isolation ever happening in our lifetimes. If we go back a couple of years and see what Chief Justice Samuel Alito said, he said, the pandemic has resulted in previously unimaginable restrictions on individual liberty. Doesn't that sound like isolation? Unbelievable restrictions on individual liberty. You don't get to be with that person. During COVID pandemic, arguably, you had a better chance of not feeling as isolated if you were in the plumbing aisle of Home Depot. You couldn't go to church. You could go to the strip joint. You could go to the plumbing aisle. You could go to the big box liquor store. But you were going to be isolated from so many of the key pieces of your life. Recently, I had the chance to watch a music video from Taylor Swift. And it was called Antihero. And it received several awards. But there's a lyric in there that goes something like this. We're willing to look at the sun, so to speak, that glorious brilliant sun. We're willing to look at the sun, but we're not willing to look in the mirror. That's why I want to talk about isolation today. If we don't look into the mirror of what has happened with isolation, we are going to be the lesser for it. So let's just unpack isolation, if you will, from age groups. Let's go 0 to 5. I don't think it takes any imagination at all to see the devastation that would be wrought by isolating 0 to 5-year-olds one from another. And remember, isolation isn't just physical isolation. It isn't just saying you can't be within 25 feet of one another. Isolation would mean not being able to get outside of your bubble and into their bubble. And you're certainly not going to be able to do that if you're being told that you've got to march to lockstep, you can't go to school, you got to wear masks, you don't get to see one another's facial expressions, the smiles, the frowns, and all that. That's easily recognized for the 0 to 5-year-old. And then you get to the 5 and 10-year-olds. The 5 to 10-year-olds, they like to play together. They just love to run. They exhaust the adults. They exhaust grandparents, let me tell you. And then you got the 10 to 15-year-olds. This is where, when you're isolated, this is where the seed of mental distress creeps in. This is where young teenagers start to think, is life worth living? What would the world look like if I weren't here? And then when you get to the 15 to 20-year-olds, you have all these dichotomies. You've got a 15 to 20-year-old very possibly being told, you got to join the workforce, you got to join the military, you need to do this. And they're over here saying, for what? You've taken away my liberty. You've isolated me from my friends. You've told me I can't do this, this, or this. And then once we get past 20, I think each generation has its own challenges coming from isolation. But isolation does so much more than what we might think about on the surface. Let's take the issue of safety. Isolation feeds crime. Cities that have bustling sidewalks filled with people going to and from work, to and from restaurants, to and from events. These are not unsafe places. There is a collective safety that comes from people being with one another. Flip that around. You've got someone walking alone. No one within 75 yards of them. That isolation makes that single person a potential candidate for crime. We know that's happening. Isolation affects safety immensely. What about accountable government? You know this phrase, divide and conquer. How do you divide? You isolate. You take someone and you say, they're gaining too much traction, too much momentum. We got to shut them down, isolate them. In my situation, there was an effort to isolate me by calling for a state medical board investigation of me every few months for 3 years. Did I feel isolated? Absolutely I did. Did I feel like I better be more cautious than ever in saying what I say? Yeah, I sure did. Fact of the matter is, there were times where I just asked myself, why in the heck don't I just keep my head down and shut the hell up? Isolation for me meant censorship. It meant putting at risk my livelihood, but also compromising the kind of lives my loved ones had. Isolation was a linchpin to do so many other things. How does isolation affect freedom? I think that's pretty clear. If you don't have the ability to assemble, First Amendment, right? If you can't get together and raise your voice by adding other voices onto it, that isolation will absolutely undercut your freedom. What about education? Well, there the studies are clear. If you isolate learners, they will learn less. When you let a learner build upon the lessons of this teacher and this teacher and this teacher and this student and this student and this student and this family member and this grandparent, learning exponentially grows. And it's the kind of learning that is real. It's the kind of stuff that gets parlayed into everyday lives. We know that when you isolate someone and you put them in front of a cathode ray tube, a computer screen, and say, sit there for the next 3 hours and learn what you can, there will not be as much learning. How does isolation affect tyranny? Well, that should be pretty darned obvious. I mean, tyranny is going to function most powerfully when there's no coalesced opposition. And the way you don't have coalesced opposition is you isolate everyone. Have you seen what's happened in Australia and New Zealand over the last 3.5 years? Did you see the kind of rigid policies that demanded that people be isolated? I want to talk about that a little bit. But I also want to mention that there's some hope there. Because I don't know if you saw it, but the New Zealand elections have recently taken place, and they flipped things upside down. And the indication is they don't appreciate that hardcore government style that demanded that citizens be isolated. Now, I know that a lot of people say, listen, isolation over the last 3.5 years made all the sense in the world because we were dealing with something we've never been before. I just want to put a little bit of a different slant on that. I want to talk about smallpox. Now, arguably, smallpox has been virtually eliminated from our population, perhaps other than laboratories. But smallpox is an area of study that we can glean some lessons from what we did. So let me go to this. Several factors contributed to the fact that in 1980, the World Health Organization said that smallpox had been eradicated from the earth. What were those factors? Well, smallpox was an easily diagnosed clinical disease. It lacked subclinical infections, which meant when you were sick with it, you knew it. You weren't going around spreading it asymptomatically. An absence of transmission during a prodrome was also part of it, so that if you were in the early stages, you would not transmit it. And a lack of an animal reservoir. These all were part of why smallpox could be eradicated. And these were dramatic differences from COVID-19, or for that matter, influenza. What happened over the last 3.5 years was we had quarantine policies that truly are perhaps the most isolating of all the measures, where you, against your will, were quarantined. There was an article in Time magazine that had talked about how devastating the effects of quarantine were when they were being used for Ebola. That was in 2014. And Time article said, quarantine is being used to manage fear, not Ebola. Went on to say other things, but I think that the idea of holding people in isolation, restraining activities of persons, enforcing isolation, that indeed is a deadly path to censorship. I think that if you look at some of the ethicists that guide our healthcare industry, we had Arthur Caplan talking about medical ethics. And he talked in this article about succumbing to the pandering in the face of Ebola. Now, this is 10 years ago almost. And Ebola is a whole different animal than COVID-19. Ebola has an infectious fatality rate of way more than 1% or 5%. I mean, depending upon the kind of Ebola virus and the situation you're dealing with, you could be dealing with anywhere from 10 to 50%. But Arthur Caplan said, state-mandated quarantines made little sense as a weapon against Ebola in the United States. He went on to say, not only is quarantine not needed for responsible people, if enforced, it will do far more harm than good. Tony Fauci said things like that as well over the last 3.5 years, acknowledging that at some point, some kinds of suppressive policies would do far more harm than good. I think when we look at isolation, and when we look at it really from hearts and minds, I think we can recognize that this, in so many ways, was the real tool of choice for tyrants to impose and get away with so many other draconian policies. I think you can make the argument that without isolation, censorship would have been much more difficult for some of these folks who were most devoted to power and control and suppression of narratives that were not within their comfort level. And then we get to Sweden. Thank the good Lord above for Sweden. In so many ways over the last 3.5 years, Sweden has been that one outlier. The one that said, we're not going to lock down our businesses, we're not going to lock our kids out of school, we're not going to demand masks, we're not going to isolate, we're not going to have forced quarantines. And in the end, the data looks like Sweden won. Excess all-cause mortality, Sweden's okay. Educational loss for kids, Sweden's okay. A populace that feels okay about itself, Sweden's okay. We've got some isolated pockets of that same kind of phenomenon in the United States, but perhaps nothing so dramatic. As we think about isolation, I would ask you just to take a moment and watch this video, because at some level, I think it encompasses some of the emotional response we feel when we're isolated.
Put your mask on. Put your mask on. No, you gotta wear it on, honey.
No, you gotta keep it on.
Put your mask on.
There you go. Keep it right there.
Yay, Mason! Yay!
Keep it on, Mason. Look, we're gonna keep it right here. Look. Oh,
Peekaboo, I see you. Keep your mask on. Put your mask back on.
what are you looking at? Come, keep it on your face. You gotta keep it on your face until we go outside. There you go. Mason. No, keep it on.
Did we really just live through all that? I hope that you find that as disturbing as I do. But having appreciated now the demonizing aspects of isolation and how the isolation can easily tip over into more censorship, less accountable government, less safety on our city streets, understanding all of that, what's the call to action? Because it's there in front of us. You remember the old phrase, those who do not remember are destined to repeat. There's a challenge there for us. How do we break through that isolation? Because it has literally become a way of life in way too many ways. But how do we break through it? How do we rise up and say, we can't stay in that dark cloud of isolation? It's not going to be easy. I think we all have a underlying fear of when a rubber band is stretched beyond its normal stretch capabilities, that it never goes back to where it was. We can't afford to let that happen to our spirits. If we do, then this pandemic will have done more damage to the human race and our future than anything else has in my lifetime, to be sure. So how do we break through it? Well, let's just unpack that a bit. First thing, in order to break through something or fix something, you got to recognize it. I think we're recognizing. We just talked about it for the last 15, 20 minutes. Okay, so we recognize it. Then what do we have to do? We have to ask ourselves, how is it specifically affecting my life? Because ultimately, the only way we fix something is if we come up with an answer and then find a way to make that a habit. If all we do is find an answer, say, aha, we got an answer, and then not incorporate it into our daily lives, nothing changes. When I tell my patients, listen, I want you to do physical therapy on your wrist. You broke it, it's healed, but every time you're at a stoplight, I want you to take your wrist and go like this 10 times. Because I want that range of motion returning. I need to help my patient make a habit out of something that will help them. That's what we have to do with isolation. We have to identify the areas of our lives where it's impacting. And I don't think that should be hard. All we have to do is go from when we get up in the morning to when we go to bed at night and ask ourselves, where is the interface? Where is isolation coming into my life? Well, perhaps you're married, perhaps you're not. But perhaps there's people in your life that come into play in that first hour of being awake. Don't isolate. In fact, do the opposite. Do this. Try to engage them in an overt way that you might not normally do. What do I mean by that? Why don't whoever you interface with in that first hour, why don't you try something like counting your blessings? Why don't you say, gee, it's great to be alive? Or, yesterday was a beautiful day out. I was able to rake the leaves, or I was able to play some golf, or I was able to walk the dog, whatever. But why don't you try in that first hour or so of your waking moments in a day, count your blessings and talk about them with someone else. Then when you go to work or go to school, why don't you try to be a little bit more extending? Because when you extend to others, they will extend to you. And there will be a sense of cohesiveness. There will be a sense of congregating. Congregating is opposite of isolating. That's why the founding fathers in the United States wanted to make certain that people were guaranteed the right to assemble. They have to be able to congregate. That's why during COVID-19, when so many places were told, you don't get to go to church, that was key. That was pivotal. They had to stop people from congregating, stop people from gleaning hope from one another, stop people's voices from singing. Remember, you couldn't sing in church? Remarkable. We lived through that in the last 3.5 years. So now you're at work and you're extending yourself to people more than you would. Now you're at your desk. Don't isolate yourself. It's an easy habit, and it leads to some dark mental places to go to. Get outside your bubble. Have you ever been in a place where it seemed like you knew there was something you could do or should do, but it seemed like you just couldn't move? I mean, sometimes I think we have that in the first waking moments while we're still lying in bed. But sometimes we'll have it, we're sitting in a chair, and we know that we should get up and do this, this, and this. But it seems like we're glued to the chair. Got to break through that. Push yourself. Got to break through that. Make yourself do something to make your day better. Lunchtime, interface with someone, even if it's just a 1-minute conversation. But please don't chew with your mouth full. My mom taught me that a long time ago. I think as the day comes to a close, whether it's at work or school, I think this is our chance to really reach out. If we're not going to be with people on a given night, then at least call them or text them. Just reach out. I'm not real big on having our phones be a substitute for person-to-person engagement. That would be the far better thing to do. But if that isn't a part of the day for the part of the calendar for that day, I get it. But we've got to break through isolation. We've got to celebrate the fact that as humans, we are social creatures. As humans, we can learn a lot from reading books and we can learn a lot from doing things, but we learn so much from being with others. I've often said that if you wanted to have someone go from point A to point B, point A being a student and point B being a doctor, and you only got to do one thing, one method of teaching, it wouldn't be videos for me. It wouldn't be textbooks for me. It would be apprenticeship. It would be someone coming alongside a healer who'd been in the field for years and years, and that healer transmitting what he or she has learned over the decades to an apprentice. We need to interact with one another. It's good for our soul. Quite frankly, it's probably a better medicine for our anxiety and depression than the pills you might get prescribed in a doctor's office. Isolation's a huge deal. It has poisoned our lives in an insidious way. I celebrate the fact that the people of New Zealand have come out and said, we're changing course. I'll be very honest. For decades, I've always thought that a place I would like to visit before I die was New Zealand. But during the COVID pandemic, that thirst on my part to visit New Zealand evaporated. I'm grateful to see New Zealand saying, we're going to take a new course. I can't help but think that what the voters in New Zealand responded to was an awakening. They recognized that the isolation that had been imposed on them was devastating in ways they couldn't even appreciate while they're going through it. And now that they're on the other side of it, they're saying, what can we do to break through that isolation? They did it from a public election perspective. We can do it every day, every week, every month. And if we do, we probably do more to restore a semblance of how good we can be going forward than any other thing we can do. We have the challenge before us. Let's break through that isolation that in some situations was imposed by government. In some situations, it was imposed by other tyrants. And in some situations, it was imposed by either ourselves or the people who love us most. It's a new day. I hope you accept the challenge. The shackles of isolation no longer hold us. If you want to follow our website, you can go to drscottjensen.com. If you want to purchase a book, We've Been Played, go to drscottjensenbook.com. Our conversations have the potential to make our lives richer, and even more importantly, have the potential to allow the United States to be that bastion of freedom that we've been for more than 200 years. Thank you.